All right, thank you, Ian. And yes, as I said, welcome everyone. It's really nice to see quite a number of participants here today. And although we love to see faces, we will maybe keep the videos off for now because some of us out in these rural regions don't have quite as strong of internet connections. My name is John Patterson Williams, and I think I know many of you, but I'm the coordinator of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Policy Committee. And so it's wonderful to see a lot of guests from across Western Canada and the US here today. And I also strong-armed my senior undergraduate course in natural resource management here at the University of Alberta to join. So we have a few students with us today too. So welcome. It's our pleasure to introduce Ian Epp with the Canadian Canola Council. And Ian's from Saskatchewan, and I'm sure he'll introduce himself in more detail as well. But we're really thankful to hear some industry perspectives on sustainability across the prairies, especially around canola and crop production. And of course, this carries on a theme over the last few months where we've been hearing about the various benefits and strategies that crop agriculture is taking in terms of sustainable practices across the prairies. So, welcome. Really glad to see you here. And Ian, take it away.
All right, I will do that. So yeah, my name is Ian Epp. I'm an agronomist with the Canola Council of Canada. And I'm going to go through a few different things. So just starting, oh, now it froze. There we go. When I'm not working for the Canola Council, I am also a farmer. So I come to you from the farm today, live and work on the farm near Blaine Lake, Saskatchewan. So 45 minutes northwest of Saskatoon. So I will kind of wear two hats today, a bit of Canola Council hats and then a bit of my farming hat as well. And where with the Canola Council, I work primarily with agronomist teams, so doing all sorts of agronomy work, working with farmers, with agronomists, with researchers, getting to kind of work throughout the value chain. So I get to wear that. And initially, especially when I was first hired with Canola Council, I did a lot of extension messaging, and I still do some of that. So, making messages for farmers, helping with best management practices for farmers. But then I'll wear my farmer hat and I'll, at the farm at home on the weekends when I'm doing that, you kind of take the other approach and you go, okay, this extension messaging, these best management practices are great, but how do I actually apply them? Or man, I don't have time to do that right now. It's harvest time and I just need to be, crop needs to come in the bin, or there's a rain coming, or in a perfect world in a research lab, these best management practices work really well. But man, it's much messier on the farm sometimes. So I'll wear both of those hats today and kind of work through, a couple things working with the Canola Council, a couple of things on the farm. And if you have any questions, I think we have time for questions at the end. So yeah, absolutely. I will hopefully answer your questions at the end. When I'm not doing either Canola Council or farming, because this is a group that maybe likes watersheds, I get that kind of a general impression. My other longtime hobby is canoeing. So that is how my preferred method of enjoying the water, wetlands, all sorts of things is canoeing, especially in northern Saskatchewan. I worked as a guide for a couple summers in northern Saskatchewan. So if you ever need a plug for where to go to enjoy more wetlands, water, lakes, Saskatchewan has like 100,000 lakes. The fishing is excellent. The canoe is by far the best way to do it. The farther you get away from the road and the people, the fishing and the scenery gets even more amazing. So every once in a while, I will drag my family along on a canoe trip as well. On to the Canola Council, though. So we are a value chain organization, just to give kind of a basic overview of who we are. We work with canola growers, we work with industry, so life science companies and elevators, anyone that kind of touches or plays a role in the canola world throughout the value chain are members of our organization. Specifically, I get to work with the agronomy team, so a little different than some of the other commodity groups, the cereals or pulses groups. We actually have a team of agronomists spread throughout Western Canada. So we work on very specific things. Right now, my area of expertise is market access and pesticide lead. So working on MRLs and then some sustainability. And so we have all sorts of expertise, disease, insects, any of that. We also, so we'll be in fields looking at helping farmers with making some decisions, training agronomists, and then working with researchers on what research, the outcomes of what we're seeing in the field, what research do we need, what needs to be, what do we need for the future? So just a brief overview. I cover Northwest Saskatchewan, but we cover all the prairies. So I'm going to give a little history when it comes to sustainability or carbon capture or carbon and, just kind of where we are. It's always nice to give a little bit of background on where we've been in the canola world. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, maybe when I was growing up, if you don't know how old I am, we did a lot of tillage with it. So that's one of the biggest things with canola over the last couple of years or the last couple of decades on the sustainability front is that change on tillage. Maybe we saw this. If any of you were in the agriculture space 2 years ago, it was exceptionally dry, drier than the 30s, around Saskatoon anyway. It was the driest year we had on record. So if this had been 50 years ago, we would have seen a lot of this: dust blowing, losing organic matter, soil erosion. So just a little bit of where the canola is. So canola is one of the biggest planted crops in Western Canada. Where did this come from? We're now in, 50 years ago or 80 years ago, there was no canola. Now there's a lot. We largely replaced summer fallow, kind of as people were reducing their tillage, reducing their summer fallow, continuous cropping. That's when canola acres started to creep up. Wheat acres have stayed fairly stable, and there's a few other crops that aren't shown in here, but your pulse acres and all those acres have kind of grown out of that as well. But canola was the big one, replacing summer fallow. So when we look at soil erosion growers were planting wheat a lot, but you need something else in crop rotation. Sounds funny to say now with canola being a big crop, and quite often canola rotations is the conversation. But if you look back a few decades, it was just wheat, and then maybe summer fallow, then wheat, or wheat, summer fallow. Wasn't a lot of other crops. So we largely replaced summer fallow with the big growth in acres. And then where we are maybe today, we've gone from that to maybe something like this. This is actually on my own farm, and this would be no-tilling into a hayfield that was old and required a refresh anyway. So, direct tilling into there. So we would have no tillage, and we're planting a canola crop directly into a hayfield that needed a refresh. The alfalfa was mostly gone, and it was quack grass and weedy. So a complete kind of swing on where we do for tillage. Just a couple things on soil health. There's a lot of different angles you could take on canola, and we'll kind of blitz through the review here. But conservation tillage, which is really key to a lot of canola production, especially in these dry years where the last couple of years we've been very dry.
Ian, I think you just muted yourself accidentally.
Look at that. I muted myself somehow. The whole two screen thing. I'm not sure how that happened. Sorry.
That's all right.
All right. So soil health has been improving, and especially throughout the prairie growing regions, which is really good because we don't have a ton of extra topsoil. If you go somewhere south of the border where they have feet and feet of topsoil, here we are managing a very little bit of topsoil. So anything we can do to reduce soil erosion and improve organic matter is really beneficial to our crops. Make sure I don't mute myself. Anyway, and what that translates to in numbers is between 1981 and 2001, the amount of energy required just from high tillage to a no-till system was reduced by 43%, 71% reduction in greenhouse gases, and then land improved efficiency. So we're getting better yields out of this. And especially in Western Canada, one of the biggest factors is better use of water. We don't have a lot of extra water, generally speaking. And anything we can do to utilize that water means we can grow more crop on the existing land base. So land management, if you look at the history, we've reduced summer fallow, reduced tillage, and that very much reduces fossil fuels. Canola Council has a few different environmental sustainability goals. Some of these are for aiming for 2025 when this was first put out. So reductions in fuel, increased land efficiencies, that'd be more yields on the acres we're producing, right? We don't want to we don't need more acres, but just on the acres we're already using. And then as part of that, more carbon sequestration. And then the 4R program for nutrient uses. I'll talk a little bit about that later. The one interesting thing with canola from a sustainability standpoint is just our unique relationship with bees. Canola is an excellent crop for bees. We like the bees, they pollinate. On my own farm, we have 3 different bee colonies that are usually in an area, blocks of land that always have some canola around. And the beekeeper is very happy, and I am very happy when I get some honey at the end of the year, but the canola crop also benefits from it. So a little bit of where we are. When I talk about farm plans, there are many. So we're in winter now. When I'm working with farmers or agronomists, we're making a farm plan. We're dialing in the details. What went well last year? What didn't go last year? Where do you want this farm to be in 5 years or 10 years? Or where are we headed? And usually what happens then is come May, you're day 3 into the field and the farmer and everything's gone sideways or something has changed. Maybe your perfect plan, something broke down, something just is very unexpected. The field's too wet. I don't know. So just kind of one thing we need to keep in mind when working with farmers and just in agriculture is working with Mother Nature. Things get very messy. The plans have to change and be very adaptable. Any kind of a plan we're making, whether it's a fertility plan, a pesticide plan, a cropping plan, we got to be pretty flexible in what we do because a lot of things get thrown into the mix in the busy time. And with Western Canada, we plant our crop and harvest our crop in a fairly tight window. So everything has to happen in a pretty small window. There's not a lot of downtime. So anyway, that's always just the fun as we enter this winter, what I would call winter extension season. We're making plans and farmers have the best of intentions. Industry, we have the best of intentions. And then we'll come May and some pest we didn't properly anticipate for will suddenly be the front page that we're dealing with that, hasn't been a problem for 5 or 10 years or 15 years. So where we look at now, so from all that tillage, we look at things like this. So canola is a small crop, but we do work really hard to get our plant stands at just the right level. On the top right there, you'll see a plant stand off my own farm. And that's kind of what you want is lots of plants. But again, you can see the stubble and the residue in between. This would be a no-till, a direct seeded system. The nice flowering yellow canola you can see basically on that same field just a little while later. And then right through harvest. So I'll talk about a little bit of some of the trends we see in canola. One of them will be straight cutting. You'll see the bottom left there, the straight cutting canola. I think we're pushing close to that. I don't know. There's wide ranges depending on the area you're in, but probably half the canola, close to half the canola could be straight cut. And even 10 years ago, that would have been maybe 5%, maybe 10%. We see a big shift towards straight cutting canola. Not every canola field's a candidate for straight cutting, but there's some benefits to that. You don't have to run a swather across it in really windy conditions, and the varieties have changed to make it a lot easier to straight cut canola. Going back to the carbon for just a little bit here, there's a lot of interesting things when you talk about carbon. Farmers are growing multiple crops, right? You need to grow multiple crops. You need to have a crop rotation, and each have kind of their strengths and weaknesses. If you're in a pulse crop, you don't need to throw a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, right? You're fixing that nitrogen, which is excellent. But disease issues mean you can only grow a pulse crop every couple of years. In canola, what we see is it requires a lot of nitrogen, but it also sequesters a lot of carbon. 1.5 times the amount of wheat. And you think those are both big biomass, big carbon type crops. And the one thing with canola, it actually sequesters a lot of it below ground and actually a lot of it farther deeper than a lot of other crops. So actually below the 20 centimeter mark. So the deeper the carbon is sequestered in the soil, probably the longer it's going to remain in the soil and remain there. So just one of those interesting things with canola. It's a big crop. It does require quite a bit of fertility, but we also sequester quite a bit of carbon. And if you look in Western Canada at the amount of carbon we're sequestering, canola plays a big role and a rising role there, that canola line here. So we're sequestering quite a bit more canola. That is kind of the projections from, I think this is from 2017. Well, canola plays a big role. And this is just the top 20 centimeters. I mentioned that canola sequesters carbon below that line. So that's one of the things we're working with researchers to have a better inventory that kind of accounts for the carbon deeper in the soil profile as well. And just where we might be headed with that. So lots of, if you look back to 1990s, again, with the no-till, with the changes, we sequester a lot more carbon in the soils. And this is, environmentally, this is a good thing. This is also really good for farmers. Having higher organic matter helps us buffer nutrients, helps us hold on to water, helps us grow. It gives us some sort of resilience in the widely fluctuating weather conditions that you might see. Not a silver bullet by any means, but does help to some degree. And then soil organic carbon, where we see from 1970s to 2015, and the prairie growing regions, we see a lot of increase in soil organic matter. Not so much in Eastern Canada or maybe in the parts of Eastern Manitoba where there is still a bit more tillage. Eastern Canada also has some different environmental conditions, but in Western Canada, we see a lot of a solid increase in soil organic matter. And then just a little bit of a global perspective on where we are from Canada. So when we look at the amount of carbon that takes to grow the crop versus a lot of the other places that grow canola or rapeseed globally, we actually end up being the lowest, having the lowest carbon footprint. And that's kind of a function of our no-till, which I've already talked about, the conditions we're growing in, and the management. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the management and some of the things we're still tweaking and changing in future management. Yeah, so on average, we're 42% less carbon than a lot of the other canola or rapeseed growing areas globally. So one thing that's cool is canola actually reflects, it does a good job of radiative forcing. So it's the most reflective prairie crop. So it actually reflects a lot more sunlight, which helps with global warming. Something I didn't know, and a long-term researcher was kind of his pet project to work on this. So a little bit of where we are going. This is actually a couple pictures from yesterday. Yesterday, I had the joy of chasing around a combine using a stripper header. So a stripper header, we actually leave all of the biomass standing. We just kind of pull the seeds and the pods of the canola into the combine. And so you can see that stubble was, man, it was 3 to 4 feet tall in place. This is a tall canola crop. Is this the future of canola? Too soon to tell, but farmers are trying all sorts of inventive things to, save fuel, to lower their carbon footprint. This grower was trying this, so we were out there measuring harvest losses. Stripper headers are really cool. They're kind of designed for wheat, but if they work in canola, that would be a bit of a game changer maybe for certain regions of the prairies where, maybe you can catch more snow this way, and you could, this combine was going a mile and a half faster. So one of the joys is chasing around a combine and getting completely full of dust and dirt chasing the combine, but kind of a new cool thing. So there's lots of potential for the future of where we might go with canola. This is just one of the practical things, and topical because this was my day yesterday. One of the other things that the Canola Council is doing is working with the off-cap funding or the Canola for Our Advantage. So fertility is one of the big things with canola. We do need quite a bit of fertility to grow it. When you're growing a crop that's high in protein and it's got a lot of oilseed, oil just requires a lot. To build an oilseed crop requires a lot of fertility. So making sure we're managing our fertility program. So we've partnered to help growers kind of do a better job of being more precise, more efficient, more sustainable with their fertility applications. So one of those things would be maybe a variable rate fertilizer. So maybe we're not decreasing or increasing our fertilizer rate, but we're making sure we put it exactly where we need it and maybe cutting back where we don't need it. So you might one of our program things is making mapping like this. So this would be a half section of land. This is actually from my own farm, and there's quite a bit of a difference. Those color differences just mean there's quite a bit of a difference in soil there and probably in growing potential. Generally, the darker green will be more productive, but you see all those little fluctuations. So if we can target the fertility for those zones and add, get the right amount in each zone, not too much in some areas, too little in other areas, we can actually increase productivity without changing our actual total fertilizer rate. So one of the things we're working with growers is something like that. So it's the right source of fertilizer, the right rate, and then at the right time. You want to reduce losses, and then the right placement in the soil as well. Another thing we're working on, Canola Council, this is actually one that's more of maybe a bit of a pet project of mine, is unproductive acres. So we have lots of canola fields. Canola fields are big. We have lots of acres, and we have these areas that within fields that are unproductive. It could be a salinity thing. It could be a too wet, too dry, too something. Anyway, anything that stands out. These acres are unproductive in the sense that maybe they grow some crop, but they're probably unprofitable for growers. So this might be, 2% of the field or 5% of the field. And there's some research that's showing that, a lot of fields maybe have that 2 to 5% of their fields that are unprofitable. Not a big area, but maybe those are areas that a farmer is farming, but they're losing money in them. So what do we do to either make them more profitable, or is there something we can do to just maybe not farm them? Maybe putting them back to a wild space of some sort is actually the best financial decision for the farmer. And there's all the environmental benefits that would go along with that. So the first step is really identification of, do I have unprofitable areas? Where are they in my field? So if you look at a field like this, if you look here, a field from my own farm, there's 160 acre half or quarter section, and we farm about 130 acres. We used to farm about 150 acres. And if you notice in here, there's all sorts of, nice zigzags. And we've actually let this go back. We've planted some grasses in there, and this is kind of a bit of a floodplain. So quite often seasonally, it's kind of wet in there, and there's a little bit of salinity issues in there, and we could farm it, but it wasn't particularly profitable. If you looked at the soil maps and you look at the yield maps at the end of the day, it was break even at best, and quite often for the amount of inputs and management required, and it grew lots of weeds and kochia, and it was just a tough one to manage. So we've changed our border a little bit, and there's always a bit of a debate on where do you change it or where do you draw the lines, because it's kind of this continuum between really productive to maybe not productive at all. But one of the options for there, so identifying these unproductive acres and then finding something to do with them. You don't want to just abandon them. You don't want them to just be growing weeds. but you plant them to grass? Is that leading to a wetland? And it kind of depends on what's going on in those spaces. Why are they not so profitable? And then you could maybe you take the fertility the fertilizer that you were putting into these unproductive acres, and maybe we target a zone in this main part of the field that's really productive, and maybe that's where we really push the yield. So in these cases, actually, I think if you look at the total bushels coming off this quarter section, I think it actually hasn't changed, or maybe it's increased a little bit, but even if we say it hasn't changed, but I'm also reduced my acres by a significant amount, and I don't have to go through these areas and worry about the weed control and what are we going to do in these unprofitable acres. So just one example of helping farmers to really target and manage both the profitability and the environmental considerations. These kind of have to go hand in hand. Oh yeah, this would be the map from that exact field. So looking at, we got different zones of profitability here, and now this white area in the middle, that's the one we've let go with salinity, flooding, all sorts of issues that made it not particularly profitable and kind of a pain to farm. So if you look across Western Canada on maybe scaling this a bit, there's 2.5 million acres of somewhat salt-affected agricultural land. And then there's another 20 million acres that are at moderate or high risk of developing salinity problems. So how do we manage those, and what are we doing with them? Salinity areas, obviously, it's a long-term problem, not something that's going to solve itself overnight. There is no short-term fix for it. Usually that means you have a water problem, or you have a lot of water, a high water table. So some of those areas, maybe it is changing the water table, and some of those areas, maybe it is letting them go, putting them back into a grass or a salt-tolerant forage crop or something like that. And maybe that's an area, and these are also areas, because we have a high water table, and if we're putting fertilizer there, it's actually a perfect spot for high fertilizer emissions. We don't have a crop using the fertility, and high water table equals a lot of losses. So we look at losses from fertility, carbon losses, those are usually really hot spots. So we can kind of massively reduce in areas where salinity is a big problem. We can really reduce our fertilizer losses and put these areas into something that are maybe more profitable than just growing weeds. And especially with weeds like kochia being very herbicide resistant and really problematic, identifying those key areas and doing some sort of management plan is really important. Yeah, again, in fields, we have lots of different things. So it's ways of managing it. You have stream margins, you have road margins, wetlands, perennial. We have all sorts of things. And so one of the things we do is we also partner with researchers to kind of work out what's the impact of a road margin or a perennial grassland or a wetland on the actual crop. Is there some sort of effect there that we haven't properly accounted for in the past? Beneficial insects, these areas could either be hosts of insects that maybe are problematic, or they hosts of beneficial insects that are actually reducing pest insects in the crop. So Paul Galpern is one of the researchers at the University of Calgary that we partner with to look at what are the effects of that, or effects of keeping a shelter belt or planting a shelter belt. The landscape has lots of effects, and it's tough to tease out, but all of those, maybe, is there an impact on yield? If we have maybe a quarter section of canola versus 4 quarter sections all together with kind of no landscape or no off-field habitats, no margin effect. So I went through that fairly quickly, but lots of questions, lots of things going on in the canola space, both on the farm perspective and on the Canola Council perspective. So that's a bit of an overview of some of the things. I could have gone a little deeper, but I thought I'd keep it kind of a overview, and I'd love to answer your questions. I actually prefer to answer questions versus just talking for a long period of time.
Great. Well, thank you, Ian. And we'll give a round of applause, or you can do the little hand clapping thing too if you want, everybody. But know that everyone is cheering you on here, Ian. So
it's always a funny thing with a webinar. You talk for half an hour, and it could have been the best webinar, and it could have been the worst webinar, and then that's just the funny thing with webinars.
Yeah, and especially when everyone's videos are off, and it's even better.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage you, if you'd like to put, we'll have some questions now, and I encourage you to stick around for about 10-15 minutes for that. But when you do ask your questions, you could either put it in the chat box, or you can just unmute and speak. You can put your hand up if you like, but we'll manage this. So let's open it up. Any questions? How about I start with one? You said you used the term sustainability a lot, Ian. And so what does sustainability mean to you? What is that? term is it?
You know, it's the common vernacular to use when talking in this space. I actually everyone has a different definition, which is always one of the more challenging things when you try to roll them together. If you get me on a grumpy day, I'll say I don't really like the word sustainability. Not that there's anything wrong with it, just it means something else to everybody. In the context of the Canola Council and what we're working on here, food production is really important. It's critical for society. We need food, but we also need to manage our environment. And I think when we look at sustainability, we need to do both. It can't, in some cases, individual actions sometimes are more of an either or. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit where we can work together, or we just need to, right? These are both critical things to be done. So when we look at sustainability in a canola world, we need to maintain crop production, and we need to do a better job, or maybe improve crop production and do a better job of the environmental areas. So some of that is where I really get excited about those unproductive areas, where if I can grow the same amount of bushels of canola on a couple less acres and really intensively manage those good acres, and then those acres that aren't so profitable, aren't so productive anyway, do something else with them, something that is better. I think that's where I get excited as a farmer, but also for Canola Council, that's the low hanging fruit. And not everything is quite as rosy as that, right? There, sometimes there is more of trade-offs, but there's certainly a lot of opportunity that we can do a better job with precision management that kind of helps both worlds. So I don't know, from a canola, that's a rambling explanation, but that's what I get excited about for sustainability. But it's one of those tough words.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate you taking a crack at it. I think at various points we all sort of struggle with that definition. So yeah, thank you.
Do you want me just to read through some of the questions in the chat there? Or are you going to read them out? Or
I can read them out, and then I might even ask this. So Roderick Garland, you said, do you find bees are very aggressive in the canola fields? Do you want to elaborate on that, Roderick, or is that good?
I can give you my quick answer on being in canola fields with bees. So like I mentioned, I have a couple beehives on canola fields. And when it's the right temperature, usually first thing in the morning or a bit cooler, but on a sunny day and the canola is flowering, it is just a highway from that beehive out through the canola field. And I don't know if they're aggressive. If you get in the highway, every once in a while they will literally run into you if you're too close to the highway, where they think they're just like head down going. But it is a busy, busy highway. And it's interesting that, yeah, they're, especially cooler temperatures, they are there and they are busy, and they fly kilometer after kilometer. I had one beehive this year where there was no canola within a mile, and I asked the beekeeper, like, problem for you? Or he's like, no, they'll find, like, not a problem to go a couple kilometers. Ideally, maybe they want it closer, but yeah, I don't know how aggressive. I don't get stung a whole lot in the fields. I think they're all business. They're bit to the flower, to the hive, and turn around, it seems.
Right. We also have a question from Jacob. How many acres? So just about your farm. How large is it? What's sort of the rotations?
2,500 acre farm. So I don't know. You can make whether that's big or small. There's a lot bigger and there's some smaller. Yeah, I farm with my folks, and so part-time. I always refer to it as my hobby. It's my evenings and weekends during harvest time when I'm working for the Canola Council. But our rotation is so canola wheat are the big crops. We try to run a 3-year rotation. So canola wheat, and then the third one is something else. Trying to get something else in rotation. So peas fit a good thing, but with the Phanomyces disease issues in peas can be challenging to grow. You can't quite grow them on a 3-year rotation anymore, it seems. So we grow some flax, some oats. We have grown some barley, kind of mix up something else in the rotation.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Jacob, for that question. I see you, Jamie Hewitt, and I know Ian Glass as well. I'm noting you down. First, let's just follow along here. Erica Bachman. Erica, why don't you ask the question? You're very articulate. If you want to.
Always call me out. Hey, John.
I try.
Thanks, Ian. That was great. I always enjoy hearing you speak. Yeah, I'm curious. We often talk about the win-wins and the low-hanging fruit, but I'm curious, what are some of the good environmental practices that are kind of the hardest for you to encourage producers to adopt, or for organizations to encourage producers to adopt?
That's true. I do focus on low hanging because that is where we find progress, I think. But anyway, high hanging, there's lots of ways that, again, crop production is somewhat, we are removing crops from bushels or crop from the field. So it is somewhat of an extractive process, I think, by definition. And I think there's some part that's hard to get around that at a fundamental level. But that being said, we need food. So again, the crux of the big issue, where that kind of hits the nuts and bolts, we have lots of questions with growers on, so I have this area that's not saline, but it is wet. Do I tile drain it? Do I drain it? Do I restore it to a wetland? How do I manage that? If I drain it, it might be the most productive acres on that field, right? It might have the highest organic matter. And if I can sustainably, or if I can now reliably plant it year after year and it's not going to flood out, I think those are some of the tougher ones where the farmer has to choose between maybe restoring a wetland or maybe the most productive 5 acres on his quarter section, right? And that is some of the question where growers have, there's lots of different ways you could spin off that. There's lots of different ones, but those are some of the questions that growers are sitting there with, expensive farmland or, trying to manage this. And so there are certainly opportunities. Saline ones are easy ones because they're tough to fix. They really probably, if it's that saline that it's that bad, a wetland or something else besides cropping is probably your low-hanging fruit. But some of these areas where that's not a thing, that's a real question for growers, and there's lots of wrestling. There's lots of different ways to attack that problem and lots of different outcomes out of that, whether it's leaving it or leaving one wetland area and doing something else with another one. That's the first one that comes to mind. There are other ones, but it's, one of the things with environmental things is, fertility rates. We focus a lot on that, and there is some low-hanging fruits, but at the end of the day, oilseed, or whether it's your protein in your wheat, you need nitrogen in the process to build those things. It's fundamental to building those things. So, we want to balance it. We want to minimize the losses. That's the low-hanging fruit. But the hard part is, you're buying fertilizer for next year, and, there's certainly a carbon footprint to it, but, that's what you need. Even if you steward it correctly, there is still a carbon footprint to that crop you're producing. I don't know. Some of those things are challenging, and, we nibble around the edges of them, but it's tough to know sometimes. And there's a lot of, I mentioned how messy it gets in the field. Every case is a little bit different. When you sit down with a grower, you always have to learn the backstory, learn the story, get to know the grower to figure out what the nuances are of each individual case.
Yeah,
Right.
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Erica and Ian. Maybe we'll jump over to a hand raise now. We'll still get through the other ones, but Jamie Hewitt from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada.
Oh, thank you. And again, Ian, great job, great presentation. Some very common aligned messages, and glad to hear them again. A couple of questions, just quickly. So the 2 to 5% sort of estimates of unproductive acres. I mean, I think we know there's certain soil zones that maybe it's on the higher end, and certain soil zones where we know it's on the lower end. But what kind of analysis were you using to come up with that 2 to 5-ish%? Is that kind of, speaking with farmers and just kind of getting a feel for your engagements there, or are you guys running a little bit of analysis behind that?
Some of that, that'll be a combination of work. Some of that would be so it varies widely, right? So when you're dealing with a farmer, it's mass in my area. If you go to the black, farther northern and where they have bush and sloughs, it's like 30%. I think my farm would average maybe 130 acres on a quarter section of actual productive or farmable land. If you go into somewhere down or some lacustrine soil, it's like 160 acres square quarters. Like that's the dream for me. No, anyway, when you're driving things straight and when you're trying to work and do your canola council making presentations while driving an air drill or something, straight is really good. And I don't have a lot of straight, so I do it like, oh, it's a corner, and then I'm turning my tractor while I'm working for the canola. No, that would be a combination. So some of that work would be, we did some work with some precision on overlap and sectional control. And so I pulled some of those numbers. One of those numbers came out of there, and I think there is something else. I'd have to look. There's another reference. I have pages with references. I don't have it open. There's something else with that, but again, it varies widely depending on the region. Some of the unproductive acres, some of that came from some salinity work as well. Sorry, I don't have a reference off the top of my head, but it does vary widely, and really it's a goal of identifying them. I think that's the low-hanging fruit on that front, is identifying where the acres are unprofitable. And I say profitable versus, a certain yield target, because really, if a grower is not making money, man, there's so much incentive. And anytime we can turn that, then a grower is now on board maybe. And now that makes it a lot easier to kind of make some messaging and do something about that. And the next thing is just identifying why is it unprofitable? I focused a little bit on salinity, but is it a sandy ridge? Is it something else going on in the field? In parts of Alberta, you'll have really low pH soils that, either you need an amendment of some sort to change that pH, bring it up, or maybe that is, anyway, that's that's the things. And I didn't really talk about things like sectional control, but we certainly have a lot better way of managing some of those acres or some of that, the overlap and some of the effects of maybe leaving a funny shaped wetland or a funny looking something, because we can use our sectional control to minimize the fertilizer overlap, and then all of those kind of things. That's another kind of layer that adds into the mix.
Yeah, tremendous. And my follow-up question to that, and a little bit linked to Erica's question, and you can decline answering this if you want, but how does having rented land versus your privately owned land differ on how you implement some of these projects, I guess, especially, we'll say, the rewilding of some of that unproductive land?
Yeah, certainly the multi-year rewilding or redoing, the long-term thing can be tough with rental agreements where maybe you only have it rented for 3 years and then it's gone, right? Or it might not be your land after that, or you have to work with a landlord, or you're paying a certain amount of cash monies per acre, whether you farm them or not, right? That's kind of a fixed thing. So in some cases, growers are doing a better job of working with landlords on leases and, maybe taking into account, long-term management changes and maybe the benefits of that. In some cases, again, this is why I do like the unprofitable line on there, where if you're losing money this year and next year, well, maybe we should do something even though you are renting that land still. It could change what you do in some cases. Maybe you don't spend a lot of money on the rewilding. You plant it to some sort of affordable grass and leave it be. And, there's a lot of different levels of what you do with those unprofitable acres, from rewilding to the low-hanging fruit maybe is with precision management. You just cut the fertility out. You say, man, I'm not getting any money I'm going to cut my costs. I'm still going to grow a crop there. It's not going to be as good of a crop, but at least I'm not wasting fertilizer. At least I'm not wasting fungicide on it. And in little patches, that can be, I don't know, there's a wide range. I try not to get too prescriptive, which makes it tough for a presentation like this, but really we want farmers to identify it and do something, try something that's kind of out of the box maybe, and what that looks like. So with rented land, it certainly is tough on the long-term fix, just because there's a bit more uncertainty there.
Great, thanks, Ian, and thanks, Jamie, for that question. Always good questions that Jamie brings up. Another one is from Kate Hewitt, and Kate, I don't know if you would like to speak to it yourself, or I can read it. Feel free to jump in. Kate's with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, and she says, interesting that canola is better for reducing impacts of climate change than other crops like wheat. So is there a financial incentive for farmers to grow more canola than other crops? And I imagine, to elaborate that, do you actually see reflections in like carbon payments because of the actually quantification of it that's different? So good question.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on specific carbon programs that pay for you. I don't think there is a lot of usually it's an acre thing. I don't know if there's a lot of cropping differences on those programs. I don't know if maybe they're developed enough for that. There are incentives. There's not a carbon incentive for growers to grow canola. There's not a program that says, hey, you're sequestering X amount of carbon, we're going to give you whatever, some sort of return. It's a profitable crop just growing it at face value. So growers, especially in the black soil zones or in the wetter regions, grow a lot of canola. And actually, if anything, I spend some of my days with some growers saying, you're growing lots of canola, but should we have something else in rotation? Or let's make sure we're doing a job of crop rotation. Actually on that end comes into a larger consideration on my day-to-day. Though every once in a while, I had somebody phone me a couple of weeks ago from somewhere south, close to the American border in Saskatchewan, saying, I've never grown canola. What do I do? And that's a very unusual phone call for me. But in most cases, growers are growing lots of canola because it's a profitable crop regardless. But there is no payment for carbon. And like I mentioned, there's kind of, that's the benefits of canola, is we sequester a lot of carbon. In a pulse crop, you don't sequester a whole lot of carbon, but you don't have the nitrogen, the fertility bill, right? So different ways of approaching. And I think I never get too excited about comparing this crop versus that in a way, because agronomically, crop rotation is so beneficial for managing of pests, diseases, insects. So a canola field this year is a wheat crop. Next year is hopefully a pulse crop or something the year after that. That's the key driver there. They all have their benefits and their weaknesses.
Okay, thanks so much. And then another one from Cassia James. I don't know, Cassia, you're welcome to unmute and put your video on too if you want. Pause for a moment, sort of mildly awkwardly, to see if you want to do that, and then I can read it. What are your thoughts on? Oh, there you are. Great.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to put my camera on this morning, but so I just noticed when I'm driving around the countryside that especially under canola, there's a lot of bare soil, and I'm just wondering what are your thoughts on intercropping or planting something underneath? I'm thinking more for soil conservation or biodiversity under the cash crop.
Yeah, so good question. There is some intercropping that happens. Piola is probably the most common one. So a planting of canola and peas. The peas are fixing nitrogen. Maybe there's some benefits to canola. If you look at the total yield and you separate, the yield of canola will be a little bit less. But if you look at the pea yield and you have the canola yield, usually you are a little bit ahead of where you would be if you planted just straight peas or just straight canola. So definitely some benefits. Logistical challenges are probably the biggest one on farmers having some hesitancy. You got to figure out how to plant two crops somehow with your air drill or with you got to figure out how to harvest them. Peas and canola are easy because they're very different size. They're very easy to fast and quick separate them come harvest time. Potentially you have less disease issues. So there definitely are some benefits to it. I was up in the Peace Country in Alberta this summer, and they're doing some good work on planting some grass. There are a couple different grass species where you plant your canola and then you have your grass underneath, and then the grass takes 1 year to establish. So you don't really do anything with the grass. It's just underneath your canola crop. You harvest it normally, and the next year you have an established grass. Traditionally, if you go back a couple decades, I think you would plant a grass into this field and you would just leave it be for the whole year and not get any no crop to harvest for that entire year. And then the next year you would have your fescue harvest or whatever. So actually that works really, really well. They were growing like basically a full canola crop with no yield penalty, and at the same time establishing their grass crop for the next year. And sometimes I think they kept it for 2 or 3 years, depending on which species it was. So that was a really interesting one to me. That's actually one I'm doing a little bit of research on for my own farm, and just thinking that'd be a cool one because you don't have to worry about separating the crop at harvest. You get established. Having something that's a multi-year perennial, something like that, is excellent on the weed control to shift it up from having just annual. So things like wild oats. Anyway, I have a weeds background, so I get excited talking about weeds. But anything you can do like that would break it up and have other agronomic benefits. And it is growing underneath the canola, and because the grass is, I don't know if they would say this, but it's pretty wimpy in its first year. It just kind of puts up a couple leaves. It's not like a wheat crop where it takes off. It's just kind of wimpy. It doesn't take a lot of water. It doesn't take a lot of nutrients. So yeah, if you can grow a full canola crop and then have something else established and ready for the next year, kind of a green thing in fall, it would help with things like soil erosion. That being said, in a decent no-till system, we don't have a lot of soil erosion because we're leaving all that canola material or any crop material on the soil surface from harvest time till freeze up and then in next spring. So there is some opportunities there as well, but that's one that's certainly of interest. That's I think there's maybe 100,000 acres like that in the Peace Country, and there's some in Northeast Saskatchewan as well.
Great, thanks. Now I know that I mentioned I have some of my students on the call here this morning, and they're going to be diving off shortly because class technically ends at 10:45. But I see Belle had a question. Belle, are you still on? Do you want to ask it, or shall I ask it for you? I can, happy to do so. So it's a great presentation. Oh, you go for it. Love to. Do you ever find that there's a stigma around farming and climate change, and how do you combat that besides having articulate and smooth webinars like this where you share your position? But I mean, I think that's a very valid question, right? I think in sort of the narrative globally right now, and you see there's a lot of politicization of it, which I think we want to avoid here, of course. But farmers, there's a narrative, we're feeding the world, this is great, this is profitable, but on the other side, there's a cost to this expansive canola production, of loss of grasslands, loss of wetlands. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, an easy one here.
Yeah, very easy. Can't let you have
I think one of the biggest things is there's a huge disconnect between farmers, what happens on farm, and the bulk of population, right? We're a pretty urbanized population. We don't come from farms so much anymore. There's a huge disconnect on what actually happens, and just the basic understanding of what's actually happening at the field level, and then probably at the farmer level, what is the consumer seeing, what is the consumer wanting. That disconnect is only growing wider, and we see that, just the amount of actual people that farm is very small and only decreasing, right? It's a tiny percentage of the population in Canada or anywhere globally. So some of that is basic information at some level, like I said earlier, and maybe it's my personal take on it, but we do need to grow food, and we need to do a better job of managing the environment, managing the watershed, that kind of thing. We need to do both. I don't think it's an either or. And I think maybe it's not that makes it an easy thing to do. There's a line to walk, and there's pros and cons all over the map, but certainly building relationship between urban groups and what actually happens on the farm, dealing with the easy misconceptions, and then I think you got to be honest about the upfront challenges that happen at the farm level, and then the consumers that are eating the food. What are the actual challenges going on? That building relationship in some sort of sense or many ways. I think that's that gap is only getting worse. And not that I have a solution for it, but tackling it is probably one of the few ways, or one of the ways of really trying to just bring awareness to the challenges, the strengths of farming, how far we've come, maybe why farming today looks quite a bit different than farming 50 or 100 years ago. Here are some of the pros. Here's why we've adopted a number of these practices. And here are some of the drawbacks, or here's the realities of farming today, the challenges we're dealing with, where I could put up a long list of pests and diseases and issues. And, if a farmer didn't have to spray for something, they probably wouldn't. They'd be happy to not live in the sprayer, or, not have to deal with, I don't know. There's lots of that, but I think having conversation is an excellent starting point. And then from there, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that's a big one. Conversation and being able to listen well to those other perspectives. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, thanks, Belle, and thanks for other students that need to dive off for their next class. I do see we have a question from another Chad. So how does the Canola Council view wetland and grassland loss due to increasing land and commodity prices? I guess that's, if you want to elaborate, Chad, if you're on, or...
Just land prices are being driven by high commodity prices, and that's just incentivizing producers to maximize every acre they can, and there's environmental impacts from that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things from the Canola Council is we've really pushed on a yield targets or yield intensification, really managing the best acres really well to try to push yield on those acres. So yield targets on those high acres, and not so much on increase in acres or increase. We don't have a focus on that. Obviously, some of that happens, and we're a value chain organization, but we have farmer members. We work within those spheres, and we try, whatever we do, we try to be very science-based. That's always the mantra internally, is we need data. Farmers come with all sorts of interesting things. You're like, okay, where's the data? Where is the interesting? That's why you saw me chasing combines yesterday and doing yield loss testing, because I love the idea of using a stripper header in canola, but also if the losses are no good, we need the data to make good decisions. So from a Canola Council perspective, we work really on intensifying those good acres, working good to manage those good acres. And that's where the unprofitable comes in, because even with higher commodity prices, even with all the profitability, high land prices, there's still acres that are unprofitable. And maybe I'm banging that drum a little too much, but there's still acres at $20 bushel canola. There's still acres that are just growing kochia. And this year was an excellent example of kochia fields. And those kochias are then rolling into your profitable, excellent areas, right? They're tumbling and rolling across and causing all sorts of problems. Even at the high. So obviously, I mentioned on the 1 quarter land that, where we draw the line between profitable and unprofitable is kind of a best guess depending on the year. Sometimes salinity is better, it's worse. Probably this year when canola was over $20 a bushel, I probably should have gone in, but we kind of left it as a fixed line. We think on the long-term average, this is where the profitability line is, plus some. I don't want to break, here's where we're making that line. So really focusing on that unprofitable acres, because they still exist, and working on different ways to tackle them, whether it's just dropping the fertility out, precision, better precision management of that crop to make those profitable, or is it not farming them? Sometimes that's the low hanging. Again, that's kind of our approach to it, and using the science data driven type thing is, in this case, the economics is a good selling point to growers. They understand, I don't realize, or as you're combining along, the crop is pretty thin in this area, it's never very good. But when you actually do the math, that's when you actually figure out, I'm losing money farming this area. Maybe I should do something. So that science-driven approaches are, and again, when it comes to drainage, sometimes, I don't know, there's lots of different approaches. We try to be not too prescriptive, but really, at this point on the unproductive acres, our focus is on identifying them. And then management plans are varied from there.
Right, thank you. And then I think I see one last I'm going to kind of lump together a little bit. So Erica Bachman also asked, what are the other benefits of straight cutting canola? And I was also thinking about that. You think of all the stalks left up, you capture snow, but then how do you manage that in the spring? Just wondering. And then linking that with Roderick Garland has a question. And then how do you deal with some of the natural disaster issues like lightning, hail, fires, etc.? Thinking of even some of that organic matter left on the fields. So go on, yeah.
Right. Oh, now we're back to agronomy. Now I can roll. Straight cutting canola, there's a couple different benefits. So most like straight cutting is big. The stripper header thing is really an anomaly. That's why I'm out doing the testing, because that's the only guy I know in the black soil zone using stripper headers on canola. That's why I was like, I will make the drive and chase your combine for the day. But most of it is not straight. So the stubble height is very similar between straight cut and swath canola in 90% of the time. And obviously taller is good, and we cut taller, it's less through the combine, but stripper header is kind of the anomaly, just the fun recent thing. Straight cutting, you don't have to swath it. So obviously you save a pass. Logistically, that's great. You save some diesel fuel that way. You do maybe have to manage it. In some cases, you'll be spraying it, desiccating it. Instead, sometimes you'll let it dry naturally, just depending on the year, the conditions. This year for my farm, we let it all dry down naturally because we kind of dried out at harvest, and you don't have to make wheel tracks. Why would you, save a sprayer pass is excellent. Swathing too early can cause yield loss. So in this case, you're letting it dry down. You actually avoid that. Am I swathing too early? With a really variable field where maybe you have really green patches and then really ripe patches, you can just kind of let it all dry down naturally and kind of maximize the yield throughout the region. It does take longer. So that's one of the downsides to it, is quite often you're going to be a week to 2 weeks later to harvest that field. But farmers can't harvest all their crops at one time, right? There's always some fields that they have to wait because the combine just hasn't gotten there yet. So that's why you see some of the blending. A lot of farms do the swath some early stuff to get the combine rolling, and then leave some stuff that they're not going to get to till October anyway. Let it dry down naturally. And probably one of the bigger drivers is just the varieties have come that far where they don't shatter. And actually, if you're going to have really big wind, you're down in Lethbridge or something, and you're going to have like 80-kilometer-hour winds, a straight cut pod shatter variety is going to do better than swaths that blow around everywhere. So that's another benefit. If you are going to leave it out late, swath canola can be a problem come really high winds and all those conditions. So lots of little benefits that way, but certainly something that excites a lot of growers. And when it goes well, it works really, really well.
Yeah.
The other part of that question was fire, hail, risk, crazy weather events. That's just average life for a farmer.
And that's good insurance.
I say that as somebody who had only one breakdown this harvest, and that breakdown was we burnt a combine. Other than that, we had like no little breakdowns. Great hard, but I burnt a combine. Certainly more stubble on top would be worse for fires. And certainly when you have a combine fire, priority number one is, actually saving the combine is priority A. Priority A1 is maybe not burning the whole field down while you're trying to get rid of the combine. So certainly more stubble on top can lead to bigger fires. I don't know with hail, it's not really a big issue because by the time you have all that dried residue on top, you're largely through late lightning season. As far as lightning causing fires, by the time you're like harvesting your crop, there can be lightning storms, but I don't know. I have no data for that. If I'm going to be data based, I'm going to say, I don't know. It doesn't seem like a big issue in the grand scheme of things. Hail is hail. I don't know. Doesn't matter what you do. You get hit by the white combine, it sucks. Insurance is your friend, but there's not a whole lot to mitigate. I spent a lot of time working on farmers on mitigating biotic and abiotic threats. And hail is just one of those things where figure out how you're going to insure, whether it's self-insurance, actual hail insurance. It's a tough one. Maybe pod shatter varieties of canola help you a little bit on some marginal hail, but if it's bad, usually there's like nothing. You'll take your really big canola, your 60 bushel canola crop, and there'll just be stalks or almost nothing above ground left. So never a fun conversation.
No. And then we're just nearing the end here, and but you said if I can ask another one, maybe more challenging one too. Why not? So you advise farmers and producers, of which we are. We're combining canola right now outside, but we're thinking of the science driven, and I think Canola Council, you're doing a great job doing research with Galpern's lab and that sort of thing. But as you're advising farmers for sort of the different things happening around in the in sort of the environment, but also the even the legislative environment. What do you think? How do you advise around policy change? So think of the wetland policy in Alberta and then things in Manitoba or in Saskatchewan going through different policy developments around water mitigation. Those are tricky ones, aren't they? And we're the policy committee, so I got to ask a policy related question. What do you think about those, and how do you navigate that?
Put on my policy hat and I go, I don't have a policy hat. So I do quite a bit of work on the pesticide front in canola, and so MRLs and where pesticide residues, that kind of thing. That's where my space in policy spends more time. But certainly these are tough questions. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I'm not as familiar with the wetland policy in Alberta, but these are tough conversations on how to mitigate. And I think especially when I come to wetland policies, when it comes to pesticides, pesticide residues, the policy has to be practical at the farm level. Obviously, it has to meet the larger environmental goals, but there has to be something that a farmer actually can understand and actually implement in some sense, whether it's a setback from a pesticide application from a wetland or something like that. It has to be something that actually makes sense on the ground level. And I think given that, we talked about the weather, but it has to, any of these policies have to have the flexibility to understand just the wide variety of conditions we have, even just in Western Canada, never mind Eastern Canada versus Western Canada, but the brown soil zone versus the black, and parts of Alberta, parts of Manitoba, we see so many differences. Anytime I get a complex question from a farmer I'm not aware of, it's always a 20-minute conversation on, well, tell me about your operation. Tell me about this field. Tell me what the history of this field. Tell me I need all of this information to make some of these decisions, because you're never sure what every situation happens to be a little different. And that I think policy that does a good job of reflecting that, or finding some sort of middle ground between the complexity of wetland A is different than wetland B, different than wetland C, and we're going to manage them all differently. Ideally, we're going to manage them all differently from a grower perspective, maybe from a policy perspective, and that's not easy. I'll give the policy people some credit. It's not an easy thing to craft that kind of compromise. I'm not a policy person. I far rather wear a farm hat than a policy hat. But I think that's the challenge, and I think we don't provide a lot of guidance when it comes to farmers on how they provide. Farmers are our members. They're on our board, as well as life science companies, as well as grain companies. We take some of their direction from them, but our push is always on the science. As the agronomy team, that's the space we live in. That's the space, and if we don't have, in a lot of cases, I think when it comes to wetlands or even pesticide residue, we have a lack of data in some of these things. So we're getting policy that's based on a model that maybe wasn't made in Western Canada. So does that make it a good model? Well, maybe. Is there a data gap? So actually on the pesticide front, we spend a lot of time on generating or working with researchers, trying to get research on where do we have data gaps? What can we do to fill that gap? And then find out, so is this a hypothetical risk or is this a real problem? Or, how big is this problem? Where do we have those things? That is one of the spaces that we live in, just to try to fill those gaps so that policy regulators have better information to make policy, and farmers actually have better information on, what is the actual impact here, and actual with, not just, I think this might be it, but, here's a couple of years of data, here's a pile of, a couple different ecozones, here's the actual impact of a certain agronomic practice. I think that's one of the key things. We can't make good decisions, anybody in industry, if we don't have the data to quantify what's actually happening.
Sure. Okay, thank you. It's a hard question, so I appreciate it. That's a good answer. Thanks. We're going to end with one last one from Cassia James, and I know we've hit 11 o'clock, so if people need to dive off, but we'll just end with this and then say thank you. But Cassia has been seeing more canola cut short. Is there a reason for this?
I'm not sure where you're. Again, I would talk about it's always more complicated. If you're in a dry region where we've been droughty, if the canola short, you got to cut it short to get the crop in the combine. That could be an easy explanation. There's some growers that have, if we're doing hard no-till and we're not doing any sort of tillage, now's the time. Harvest is the time when you start thinking about what are you going to do for next year? How am I going to seed into this crop? How am I managing my straw, my residue for next year, so I'm not left with a mess next spring? So some growers do cut it shorter, hoping that makes it easier. I would actually suggest that on a lot of systems, longer attached stubble is better. I have a preference and I'm coming off a couple of dry years in my farm. So I'm coming off, if you can cut it higher, I cut it as high as you possibly can. Think I can catch more snow. And actually, I think I have better luck seeding through residue with a drill. But otherwise, I'm not sure. If the crop is short, you certainly do have to cut short. But I'm not sure why else that would be. Certain varieties also. some varieties are like 6 feet tall, and some canola varieties are like 3 feet tall. So could be a shift in variety or something else.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And overall, thank you for this presentation, Ian. We'll clap for you here. I'll do it on behalf of everyone. It was a great job. And I really do appreciate, hearing some of these perspectives from the industry groups, canola growers, as you come in and this conversation between different players, agriculture, environment, communities, how we engage is so important. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And hopefully I'm trying to wrangle someone from the wheat and barley councils to chat in the next month. So stay tuned for that, everyone. So thanks, Ian. Have a good one. And thanks everyone for coming. See you next time.
All right, thanks.